January 30th, 1943, the 10th anniversary of Adolf Hitler's rise to power. In Berlin, the most powerful man in the German Air Force steps to the microphone to address the nation. Reichsmarschall Hermann Göring is about to deliver his speech when something impossible happens. The air raid sirens begin to wail. At precisely 11 o'clock in the morning, 3 aircraft made of plywood and balsa wood roar over the German capital at over 400 miles per hour. The broadcast cuts to static, then scratchy classical music. For 63 minutes, the man who once promised that no enemy aircraft would ever fly over the Reich sights in humiliated silence. This is the story of the de Havilland Mosquito, the wooden wonder that the British Air Ministry almost killed, that Germany could never catch, and that Adolf Hitler's Luftwaffe tried desperately to copy and failed. In 1938, most aircraft manufacturers understood one fundamental truth: the future belonged to metal, aluminum monocoque construction, stressed skin airframes, heavy bombers bristling with defensive guns. This was modern warfare. This was progress. Geoffrey de Havilland disagreed. The founder of the de Havilland Aircraft Company had spent years experimenting with wooden construction. His DH-88 Comet racing aircraft had won the 1934 McRobertson Trophy Air Race from England to Australia. His DH-91 Albatross airliner demonstrated that plywood and balsa could create structures both lighter and more aerodynamically refined than anything built from riveted metal sheets. De Havilland understood something that few others grasped. Wood, properly constructed, offered strength-to-weight ratios that matched or exceeded aluminum. And Britain had plenty of skilled woodworkers, furniture makers, piano builders, cabinet craftsmen who could build aircraft without competing for the metal workers, already stretched thin across the defense industry. In September 1938, de Havilland presented his radical concept to the Air Ministry: a fast, twin-engined bomber built primarily of wood. No defensive guns, no turrets, no gunners, just a pilot and navigator in a streamlined airframe powered by 2 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. The aircraft would rely on a single principle for protection: speed. It would fly faster than any fighter the Germans could field. It would be too quick to intercept, too high to hit with flak, too nimble to catch. The Air Ministry's response was immediate and unambiguous: rejection. An unarmed bomber made of wood, in an age when conventional wisdom demanded heavy defensive armament. The proposal seemed not just unconventional but reckless. Bomber crews were dying in alarming numbers precisely because they lacked adequate defensive firepower. The Bristol, Blenheim and Fairey battle had proven catastrophically vulnerable. How could anyone propose sending men over enemy territory with no means of fighting back? De Havilland was instructed to focus on producing Tiger Moth trainers and propellers for other manufacturers. The wooden bomber concept was shelved, forgotten, left to gather dust while the Air Ministry pursued more sensible designs. But Geoffrey de Havilland refused to abandon his vision. Throughout 1939, as war with Germany became first probable and then inevitable, de Havilland continued refining his design as a private venture. He invested his own company's resources. He gathered a team of engineers who shared his conviction, and he found an unexpected ally within the Air Ministry itself: Air Marshal Sir Wilfrid Freeman, a man who understood that unconventional thinking might be precisely what Britain needed. Freeman championed the wooden bomber concept against significant opposition. He argued that de Havilland's track record justified trust in his judgment. He pointed out that aluminum was already in critically short supply, that skilled metalworkers were desperately needed for other projects, and that a faster bomber might prove more survivable than a more heavily armed one. Gradually, reluctantly, the Air Ministry began to reconsider. On the 1st of March, 1940, the Air Ministry finally issued a contract. Specification B-140 called for 50 aircraft, a number that reflected continued skepticism more than genuine enthusiasm. The design was given the designation DH-98, but doubts persisted. Various officials demanded modifications: defensive armament, gun turrets, even torpedo-carrying capability for maritime strike missions. De Havilland resisted every attempt to compromise his concept. He understood that adding weight and drag would destroy the very advantage that made the aircraft viable. Construction began at Salisbury Hall, a manor house near Hatfield, chosen specifically for its isolation and obscurity. In an era of German bombing raids, dispersing aircraft production made sense. The prototype took shape in a barn on the estate grounds, built by craftsmen who had never worked on military aircraft before. Furniture makers and piano builders learned to construct wing spars and fuselage sections from Ecuadorian balsa wood sandwiched between Canadian birch plywood, bonded with specialized adhesives. By November 1940, the prototype was ready. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr., the company's chief test pilot and son of the founder, prepared for the maiden flight. At 30 years old, young Geoffrey had already proven himself one of Britain's most capable test pilots, surviving incidents that would have killed lesser aviators. Once, during a hurricane test flight, the entire canopy had detached at 4,000 feet and struck him in the face, temporarily temporarily blinding him. He had landed the aircraft by holding his face inches from the instrument panel, flying by feel and memory. The incident left permanent scars across his nose and an unshakable reputation for coolness under pressure. On November 25th, 1940, Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. climbed into the prototype's cockpit alongside John Walker, the chief engine installation designer. The aircraft sat on the grass airstrip at Hatfield, painted bright yellow, the color used to identify prototypes. Its two Merlin 21 engines idled smoothly, their exhaust creating shimmering heat waves in the cold autumn air. The takeoff was, in Walker's words, straightforward and easy. What happened next exceeded even de Havilland's optimistic predictions. The prototype reached 388 miles per hour in level flight, faster than the current Spitfire Mark V, despite being a twin-engined bomber, nearly twice its size. Handling was superb. The wooden construction proved not merely adequate but exceptional, creating an airframe so smooth and aerodynamically clean that it outperformed every comparable aircraft in British service. On December 29th, de Havilland demonstrated the prototype to Lord Beaverbrook, Minister of Aircraft Production, and other senior government officials. The response was immediate. Orders increased from 50 aircraft to 150. The wooden bomber that the Air Ministry had once dismissed was suddenly the aircraft everyone wanted. But Jeffrey de Havilland Jr. understood what his father had created better than any committee member or ministry official. Sitting in that cramped cockpit as the Merlins roared and the airframe hummed beneath him, he felt the aircraft's potential in his hands. This was no compromised design. This was something revolutionary. By June 1941, the Mosquito, as the aircraft was now named, had become one of the fastest operational aircraft in the world. The first operational missions began in September 1941, when photographic reconnaissance Mosquitoes started flying over occupied Europe. The results were extraordinary. Flying at altitudes above 30,000 feet and speeds exceeding 380 miles per hour, the reconnaissance aircraft proved virtually impossible to intercept. German fighters struggled to climb fast enough to reach them. By the time radar stations detected the intruders and scrambled interceptors, the Mosquitoes had completed their missions and vanished. But it was as a bomber that the Mosquito would deliver its most humiliating blows to the Third Reich. Consider what confronted the German air defense system in 1943. Standard RAF heavy bombers, Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, flew at roughly 280 miles per hour, at altitudes around 20,000 feet. They were predictable targets. German radar could track them. Night fighters could intercept them. Flak batteries could range them. The loss rates were appalling. During the Battle of Berlin, from November 1943 to March 1944, Lancaster bombers suffered a 5.1% loss rate. At that rate, a crew's mathematical chances of surviving a 30-mission tour were grimly remote. The Mosquito changed the equation entirely. During that same Battle of Berlin, Mosquito bombers suffered a loss rate of 0.5%, one-tenth that of the heavy bombers. The difference was not luck, it was physics. The Mosquito flew faster than most German fighters could pursue and higher than most could reach. Its small radar signature made it difficult to track. Its speed meant that by the time German night fighters received vectors to intercept, the target had already departed the area. The mathematics were devastating. A Mosquito carried a two-man crew and could deliver a 4,000-pound bomb load to Berlin. A Lancaster carried a 7-man crew and could deliver 22,000 pounds of bombs. But the Lancaster's loss rate meant that for every 1,000 tons of bombs delivered to Berlin, the RAF lost approximately 51 heavy bombers and 357 aircrew. The Mosquito's loss rate meant that for equivalent bomb tonnage delivered, RAF losses were a fraction of that figure. Post-war analysis would confirm what the statistics implied. The Mosquito proved 4.95 times more cost-efficient than the Lancaster in terms of damage inflicted per economic investment. The aircraft that the Air Ministry had almost rejected as a wooden anachronism had become the most efficient bomber in RAF service. But Hermann Göring experienced this efficiency in a far more personal manner. January 30th, 1943. The 10th anniversary of the Nazi seizure of power. Berlin is preparing for a day of celebration. Reichsmarschall Göring will address the nation from the Air Ministry building at 11 o'clock in the morning, his speech broadcast live across the Reich. Later that afternoon, both Göring and Propaganda Minister Josef Goebbels will speak at the Schöneberg Sportpalast, Berlin's largest indoor arena. RAF intelligence knows all of this. At RAF Marham in Norfolk, the crews of 105 Squadron receive their briefing. The target is Berlin. The objective is not military destruction but psychological humiliation. They are to arrive over the German capital at precisely the moment Göring begins speaking, to demonstrate that the man who once promised no enemy aircraft would ever fly over the Reich can no longer protect his own capital in broad daylight. 3 Mosquitoes take off shortly before 10 o'clock. They fly at wave-top height across the North Sea, too low for German radar to detect, then climb to 25,000 feet as they approach Berlin. The weather is terrible, heavy cloud cover most of the way, but as they near the capital, the skies clear. Sergeant Richard Lofty Fletcher, navigator on one of the attacking aircraft, had learned of the mission only hours before. "I was playing cards in the crew room when my driver first told me we were going on an op," he later recalled. "I must admit I was a bit shattered when I found out it was Berlin." At precisely 11 o'clock, as Göring steps to the microphone, the air raid sirens begin their wail. The broadcast engineers face an impossible choice. They can relay the sound of Merlin engines and exploding bombs to every radio in Germany, proving that the Luftwaffe commander cannot protect his own city. Or they can cut the transmission and leave the German people listening to silence while their leaders cower. They cut the feed. For 63 minutes, German listeners hear scratchy classical music while Göring sits in humiliated fury. When he finally returns to the microphone, his speech, according to United Press International, is uninterrupted by applause throughout. That afternoon, 3 more Mosquitoes from 139 Squadron repeat the performance during Goebbels' address at the Sportpalast. This time, the broadcast engineers stay with their minister, and German listeners hear the distant thunder of bombs and anti-aircraft fire punctuating Goebbels' words about Nazi triumph. 1 Mosquito from the afternoon raid fails to return. Squadron leader Donald Darling and his navigator flying officer Bill Wright lost to German fighters. But the other 5 aircraft complete their missions and return safely to England. The psychological impact cannot be measured in bomb tonnage. Göring would later address German aircraft manufacturers in terms that revealed his frustration. "In 1940, I could at least fly as far as Glasgow in most of my aircraft, but not now. It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. I turn green and yellow with envy. The British, who can afford aluminum better than we can, knock together a beautiful wooden aircraft that every piano factory over there is building, and they give it a speed which they have now increased yet again. This envy would drive Germany to attempt something unprecedented, copying a British design. The Focke-Wulf Tar 154 Mosquito, named explicitly after its British inspiration, was Germany's answer to de Havilland's wooden wonder. Chief designer Kurt Tank proposed an aircraft built primarily of plywood, bonded with a specialized phenolic resin adhesive called Tego film. Like the British Mosquito, the TA-154 would rely on speed rather than armament for survival. Like the British Mosquito, it would use wooden construction to conserve scarce metals. The prototype flew on July 1, 1943. Initial tests were promising. The aircraft reached nearly 700 kilometers per hour and outperformed both the Heinkel He-219 and the Junkers Ju-388 in competitive evaluations. German leadership ordered production to begin immediately. Then fate intervened with savage irony. In early 1944, RAF bombers, including Mosquitoes, attacked the German city of Wuppertal. Among the targets destroyed was a factory, one particular factory, the only factory in Germany that produced Tego film adhesive. Desperate, engineers scrambled for alternatives. Dynamit Nobel AG provided a substitute adhesive, but it proved only half as strong as the original. Worse, it reacted chemically with the wood, corroding the plywood structure from within. In July 1944, several TAR-154 aircraft disintegrated in mid-flight. Wings separated from fuselages. Pilots died as their aircraft literally fell apart around them. Production halted in August. The program was cancelled entirely in September. Think about that contrast. Britain built a wooden aircraft that the Air Ministry initially rejected as obsolete. That aircraft became one of the most successful designs of the war. Germany, impressed despite itself, attempted to copy the design and failed because they could not replicate the adhesive technology, the construction techniques, or the engineering philosophy that made the British original possible. The Mosquito was not merely faster than German aircraft. It was a product of an entire industrial and engineering culture that Germany could not duplicate. By war's end, the Mosquito had served in virtually every role an aircraft could perform: day bomber, night bomber, photographic reconnaissance, fighter bomber, night fighter, pathfinder, anti-shipping strike, transport. In the light night striking force, Mosquitoes attacked Berlin on 36 consecutive nights in early 1945. Some aircraft flew 2 missions in a single night, changing crews between sorties. The crews called these runs to Berlin the Milk Run, delivered fresh nightly. During the final months of the war, light night striking force Mosquitoes flew almost 4,000 sorties over the Reich with the loss of just 57 aircraft. Squadron Squadron 571 flew 2,681 sorties and lost only 8 aircraft, a loss rate of 0.3%. 7,781 Mosquitoes were built during the war, in Britain, Canada, and Australia. They flew reconnaissance missions over every theatre of operations. They sank submarines in the Atlantic. They struck V-weapon launch sites in France. They guided heavy bomber formations to their targets. They hunted German night fighters over their own airfields. And in January 1943, they silenced Hermann Göring in the middle of his own capital. Geoffrey de Havilland Jr. did not live to see the war's end. On September 27, 1946, he was killed testing a de Havilland DH-108, an experimental jet aircraft pushing toward the sound barrier. His body was found on the mud flats at Whitstable, his parachute pull ring untouched. He had broken his neck when violent oscillations caused his head to strike the cockpit canopy. He was 36 years old. He had spent a decade flying every aircraft his father's company produced, including the first flight of the Vampire jet fighter, and countless hours developing the Mosquito into the weapon that tormented the Third Reich. The permanent scars across his nose from that hurricane canopy that struck him during the Battle of Britain remained visible to the end. His father, Sir Geoffrey de Havilland, outlived him by nearly 2 decades. The elder de Havilland saw his wooden wonder vindicated beyond any reasonable doubt, saw the aircraft that the Air Ministry once dismissed as obsolete prove itself the most versatile and cost-effective design of the war, saw the Mosquito's philosophy of speed over armor influence aircraft design for generations to come. The original prototype W4050 survives today at the de Havilland Aircraft Museum at Salisbury Hall, the same estate where it was secretly constructed in 1940. The barn where furniture makers and piano builders learned to construct wing spars from balsa and birch plywood still stands. That is why the Germans never expected a wooden plane to outrun their fastest fighters, and why they were wrong. It was not merely that the Mosquito was faster. It was that Geoffrey de Havilland understood something fundamental about aircraft design that the conventional wisdom of the era had forgotten. Speed is not simply a performance specification. Speed is survival. The best armor is not being where the enemy expects you to be. In 1940, I could at least fly as far as Glasgow, Göring complained. It makes me furious when I see the Mosquito. That fury was the sound of a man confronting the limits of his own understanding, the sound of an air force that had invested in conventional solutions watching unconventional thinking triumph, the sound of an empire discovering that it could not copy what it could not comprehend. The British Air Ministry had tried to kill the Mosquito before it was born. The Luftwaffe tried to copy it and failed. German fighters tried to catch it and could not. That is not legend. That is not propaganda. That is birch plywood and balsa wood doing exactly what Geoffrey de Havilland designed them to do. Outrun everything.